Now that we've looked at the animation tools inside of 3D Studio Max and we've discovered where they are and what they are, what we're going to do now is spend some time learning how to use them properly. So what we've got here is a very simple animation that I've got loaded into the RAM player. And you can see here that it's just a ball bouncing up and down a couple of times and sliding to a halt. Now this is generally referred to as the bouncing ball tutorial. It's the first thing that you pretty much learn when you're learning about animation, or you learn to do when you're learning about animation. And it teaches you a few of the basic principles of animation. And those are timing, wait, squash, and stretch. Also a little bit of anticipation in there as well. And whilst you're doing this, you're going to become familiar with all of the keyframing tools that are in 3D Studio Max and how to use them in a little bit more depth. So I'll close this off first of all, and we'll say okay to that, but I don't want to worry about it anymore. And we'll just have a look and we'll see what we've got here in front of us. Well, it's just a simple sphere that I've created, and in the diffuse channel I've put a checker map just to make sure that we can see what's happening when the ball is actually deforming. Before we start our animation, there are obviously a few things that need to be set up, as always. The first one is down here in my animation dialog, on my time configuration dialog, and that's make sure we're set to PAL, which is 25 frames a second. Make sure that your active viewport is turned off and that you've got a decent length of time for the animation to occur over. We don't want to have to keep coming back to this and making changes to it as we're going along. So I'm going to type in 180 there. So I've got 180 for the length. I'm not going to worry about the start and end time because this will automatically change as I go through. So I'll press OK. And you can see that my timeline is now 180. Other things I will need to do are to right click on the object, right click over it, there we go, and go to Object Properties and make sure I've got this thing called Trajectory turned on. Okay, what that's going to do is it's going to show me a little dotted line of where the ball has been and where it's going over the lifespan of its animation. And that's very important because that's going to help us make decisions about the animation as we go through. So now that that's switched on, I'll press OK. And I'll also make sure that my new key filter by left clicking and holding is set to linear keys. Again, we will come back and we will make changes to those as we go through, but to begin with, having it set to linear is the best way of doing it. Now, I'm also going to make sure that my select and move icon isn't set to view, but is in actual fact set to world. What that means is that as I move this object in the right viewport, so we've changed that to be right, that you can see here I've got Y pointing from left to right, but also in my telltale over here, what I've got is I've got the world indicator gizmo showing that Y is going from the center point moving to the right hand side of the screen. So it's important that your move icon and that your gizmo icon are both configured so that they point in the same direction. The next thing I'm going to do is to actually maximize that right hand view, and then using my mouse I'll come out a little way and I'll press G to turn on the grid. So I'm going to zoom out far enough that I can give myself a good view of how far I think I want my animation to be. And also you can see here the black line which denotes the ground plane. So that's going to be Z0. So I'll select my ball and I will scrub through probably to frame 150. If I don't want to scrub through to 150, if I have trouble finding it, I can always type 150 down here in my time selector. I'm going to turn on my auto key and then I'm going to drag that ball right the way to the other end of the screen. When you're animating, I also strongly suggest you get used to turning off the auto key. Okay, you turn it on to animate, you turn it off when you're not animating. Also notice with the auto key switched on, 3D Studio Max has created one auto key where we've finished the animation and also one where we've started. So it's assuming that our start point was the first frame of the animation, which is very useful because now when I scrub through my timeline, it's done a lot of work for me. So that is incredibly useful. Now, with the animation that you saw before, it didn't just suddenly whiz off. There was a pause and then it started. So in actual fact, that pause was, if I scrub the time slider along here, it was 25 frames long. So what I need to do is I need to take this first keyframe by left clicking on it, and I need to drag it, and you can see in the bottom we've got moving keys just here. We've got moving keys from keyframe 1, because I just jogged the keyframe, to frame. And what I'm doing is I'm just going to gently slide that along until I get to frame 25, and I'll let go. I'll also remember to click within my time frame here, so I deselect that keyframe. Now that keyframe's red because it's a move keyframe. So I'll rewind my animation and I'll press play. And you notice nothing happens for the first 25 frames, or first second as it is. I'll press play, and then the animation, because the keyframes are set to linear, starts at one pace and finishes at the same pace. And then there's a pause at the end. So we've got a pause at the beginning for something to happen, the movement of the animation from one side to another, and then the actual animation itself. So I'll do that. Now I think maybe that's happening not quickly enough. So I'll come back. So I'll take this keyframe here by left clicking on it, and I'll drag it back until down here it says 125. Let go, deselect it by clicking there. Go back to the beginning. And I think maybe that's maybe a little bit too much. So maybe what I'll do is I'll come here and I'll take it to maybe 135. Deselect, back to the beginning, and press play again. So yes, I quite like that speed. I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to keep that. So now what we need to do is to put the bounces in. Okay, so I'll drag down a little bit to give myself some room here. I'll turn my auto key back on again. So to be careful now, because anything you move will animate. And something you have to be really careful with in 3D Studio Max is that most of the options in here, if it's a spinner or anything like that, will be able to animate. So be really, really careful. So to begin with, I'll maybe go to, say, frame 35. And I'm not being particular about this. Don't think that you have to do yours to frame 35. I'm just doing mine to about frame 35, okay? It's because what I want is a nice, quick jump. And you can see here, we've got a really big jump to begin with. So we've got, this is the main keyframe here. And these smaller dots represent the in-between frames, between keyframes. So I've put one movement in, and you can see hopefully just there we go, there's a little red tick, and that denotes the fact that there's a keyframe in what will be the Z position. But now what I need for my ball to hit the floor. So if I'm going to do that, what I could do is I'll just come, if I've got a sort of a leap up here, I want it to hit the ground sort of fairly straight down. I don't want it to be too much forward movement when we come down. So I'll probably come to maybe 45, there we go. And I'll start to move the ball down. Now the thing is, I want to make sure that that hits the ground perfectly. So what I'm actually going to do is the spinner that I've got here for Z, if I right click on those two spinners over here, down in the bottom where we've got our transform type-ins, if I right click on that, I'll know full well that's going to hit the base. So now what we've got is a very angular up and down. So we need to go in now, and what we need to do is to add in some of our extra bounces. So I'll move the time slider along a little bit further, and I'll pull the ball up again. And I'm not going to pull it up as high as I did before, because we want a certain amount of sort of Newtonian physics involved in this. We want it to take a little bit longer, and then I'll right click on there. So the bounces are getting smaller each time. Okay, so I'll do it once more, and I'll pull that up, and then we'll go along again, and I'll right click and that will come down. So I'll turn off my auto key, and really what I'm going to do now is just review what I've done. Okay, now I think that these first ones, this one here, is far too short. So what I'll do is I'll take all of these keyframes by just marquee selecting them, and I'll slide them along, maybe frame 40. And then I'll take all of these and I'll slide them along as well a little bit. And now I'm going to review the animation again. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'll move that back. So we've got a shorter period of time. So he climbs slowly and then down. Yep. So that will mean that on this downward stroke, this gap here needs to be smaller, just by a couple of frames. You would be amazed the difference that 2 frames can make to an animation like this. So let's go through that again. Yep, I'm liking that. I'm just going to shorten off this bit at the end here by a couple of frames. And let's just go through that once more. Okay, well, I'm happy with that as it stands at the moment. However, the timing's fine, but the movement's a little bit angular, as you can see. So what we need to do with this is we need to just sort of change the shape of these curves a little bit. And I'm going to do that using my curve editor. So I'll click here to open my curve editor. And if we had 2 monitors, we'd be able to slide this off over onto our second monitor and have it full screen. As it happens, we've only got the 1 monitor. So what I'm going to do is in this taskbar up here at the top, I'm going to right click and I'm going to say dock to the bottom. And what that's just done, if I zoom out a little way here, is that has just given me a split screen. So I can work with all my animation down here in the bottom whilst animating with this view in the top here. So that's actually quite useful. First thing I'll do is I'll click on my filters, which is this button here, and I'm going to filter just the selected object and keep everything else at default. And as I scroll down here, you can see I've got position data and rotation data and scale data. And I'm just interested in position. Now as it stands, I've got 3 different position bits of floats or animation floats I can use here. I can use X position, which has no data, Y, which has a little bit, and Z. And it's really the Z position data that we're interested in. So we'll stay with just showing our Z position data. And I'm going to use this button here to zoom this to horizontal extents, and I'll zoom this to value extents. And what I have here in this curve is time along the bottom versus value running up. And you'll notice that if I select the Y and the Z position, even though the Y position is moving from left to right on the screen and the Z position is moving up and down, they are both represented in the same way on this graph. It's time against value. So once you sort of get used to looking at these curves, you'll start to be able to read your animations a lot better. Also notice that your Z is blue, your Y is green, and your X is going to be red. And that's going to be true of, I don't know if you can see these dotted lines here, hopefully you can. This is true of your rotation as well, and of your scale. So now we've determined the fact that we want to look at our Z position. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have to change the shape of some of these keyframes. And it's really going to be the ones, these 3 at the top. Because when you bounce a ball, it's always slower at the top of the arc than it is when it hits the floor. By this point, there's a lot of energy being released, and then here there's a lot of energy being sort of stored as the ball falls towards the floor. But when it's at the top of these curves, it's fairly slow. So what I want to do is I want to use some of my preset tangent types here, and I'm going to use my tangent set to slow. Now by default, this will set them for going in and going away from the key point. So I'll just click that once. You notice it doesn't automatically update in the viewport. I'm going to have to middle click and just drag that. And now you'll see that our curves have updated. So if I deselect that and I go back to the beginning of my animation and I press play, you can see that what we've got there is a very nice looking animation now. This is bouncing nice and freely. And you can see he's holding longer at the top than he is when he gets to the floor. It's a bounce and a bounce and a bounce. Just pause that and go back to the beginning. Now we've got our basic movement in there. We want to start putting some of the squash into this and the stretch. So I'm going to start by moving to frame 20. I'm going to turn on my auto key. I'm also going to go to my uniform scale tool. And again, I'm going to make sure that I'm working in the world orientation. Now with this, I'm going to make it a little bit more clinical because I want these to be even shaped bounces. So I'm going to right click on my select uniform, and you'll see here, I've got my scale transform type-in tool up here. So I'll move that down here out of the way. And what I'm going to do is I'll start off just by dragging down the scale of the object. And I'll get to a point that I think is enough. So I'm looking at that, and that's probably about 50%. Okay, so I've scaled the height of our ball down to half its height. Now, if I do that, the mass of the object has to go somewhere. You can't just squash something down in the real world and expect it to lose height without that height being dissipated in the width. So what I'm going to do is in my Y and my X, I'm going to increase these above 100. So I'll probably make them 150 each way. There we go, 150 each way. Press enter. And that's now really squidged that ball out. Now we've done that up until frame 20. So if I just close that, what you'll see is that now between frame 0, frame 20, we've got a squidge down. And you notice that I've done that before we get to frame 25. Okay, because what we're then going to do is we want the stretch to happen before the ball takes off. We don't want the ball to be fully squashed then and then start to stretch as it takes off. It needs to be stretching before it takes off. That's very, very important for the timing. Otherwise, the animation will look odd. Okay, so I'll just use my zoom tool here just to get me in. There we go. So now I'm going to move my time slider along until my squished ball is probably about one frame back, about there. Okay, so it's about 2/3 of the way up of this first curve. I'll right click on my select uniform scale, and I'll get to my transform type-in. And all I'm going to do is to reverse these values. So I'll put a 1 here, and then in front of the 150, I'll just get rid of the 1. And then again, I'll get rid of the 1 there. Just press enter. And you can see now what we've got is a stretch. So as I come through here and I just scrub this time slider, you can see we've got a squidge down. And this is our anticipation. This is what's called anticipation. Because at the beginning of the animation, we won't be able to see these curves. Because the ball's squishing down, we're anticipating that something is going to happen. We know that something's going to happen. And what's going to happen? Bang, there we go. The ball takes off. So with that anticipation and with that squash down, we're also adding that weight in there by having it squash and then having it take off and start to stretch as it's going up. That's adding weight into your animation. So what I'm going to say is by the time we get to the top of this curve, which is frame 40, everybody, or all these scales here, are all going to be set back to be 100. So there we go, we'll set those back to 100 and press enter. And the ball is now at its normal state. So if you watch that at the top there, if I drag the time slider along, you can see we've now got to bounce up. And he gets, just at the zenith of that curve, he gets to be 100%. Now obviously what I'm going to do is when he hits the ground here, he's going to squash back down again. But what I don't want to happen is if I don't put a keyframe in just here, where he's at 100%, then what will happen is he will start to squash down, the ball will start to squash down right from this point up here, because there won't be anything to control the scale between here and this point. Now I could go through and I could type all of that in by hand, but really, you know, I'm feeling a little bit lazy and I don't want to have to. So what I'm going to do with my modes is I'm going to come out of my curve editor and I'm going to go into my dope sheet. And if I open up this dope sheet here, what you'll see with my position is, sorry, not position, rather scale, is that I've got X, Y, Z scale. Okay, now I can show here my modified child keys. Sorry, I apologize. I can show my modify subtree, and what it does by turning that on and off, if I've got the modify subtree off, we've just got these animation ranges that I can change. If I turn that on, what I've got is a little tick, and if I click that one white tick at the top for scale, it modifies everything below that. So that's very useful. But what I've actually got here are sets of keyframes, and I've got this one, which is at 0, shows the default state. We've then got fully squashed, fully stretched, and default state. So all I need to do is to move my time slider along to the position that I'm interested in, say here. Make sure I've got that scale key selected so all of the other 3 are. If I press and hold the shift key, I can drag that along to this position here, and hopefully, there we go, that will be my, I might need to zoom in with the mouse a little way, but that keyframe, yes, I need to come one over. There we go, let's zoom in a little bit further. One over, there we are. So now I go up, and I've got a keyframe that will hold me in that scale until there. And I'll drag my time slider along, and that's fully squashed. So this means that must be, so that's fully stretched. So this must be fully squashed. This one being this stretch. So I'll left click on squash, and I'll hold shift, and I'll drag that until I get to the other side of the 100%. So exactly the next frame. So what happens is, as you come up, the ball comes down, still at 100%, and on the next frame, blup, it's squashed right the way down. Okay, so that's good. So now all I need to do is to move my time slider along till it's about up here, and I'll take my full stretch, and I'll shift, and I'll drag that along. And I'll go to 100%, probably about here now. Ooh, make sure it goes back to 0. Shift and drag. There we go. Down to the frame beforehand. Shift and drag, 100%. Next frame, fully squished. Halfway up here. Let me just double check. So that's the one I'm looking for. So we'll come all the way down, back up there. Normal squash, stretch. Forget things from time to time. There we go. So that's fully stretched. Back over here, 100%. And then I'm going to have him stay at 100%, so we can probably make that a couple of frames over. And if I rewind this animation, I take my viewport and I make it full screen. Oh, sorry, make it full screen. That's my fault. Oh, it's of course because we've got this dot. Play animation, and you can see, if I move that just down, that we've got a nice squash and stretch going on here. So squash, there's 100, bounce, bounce, and then it says this is where we're going to do a wobble. So watch that again, boom, 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 and there we go. So I'll stop that, send it back to the beginning, turn on my auto key, go to my rotate tool, and I'll set that to world again, select my ball, and I'll go to my curve editor, and I'll show just my rotation keys. Now with this, with the rotation, I'm not so worried about being absolute with my rotation order. So what we'll do is we'll say between 0 and this squash down, or the takeoff point, I'll just sort of maybe come back a little way. So we're going to do that, and then as we take off, get to about there, I'll rotate back around. So you can see we're now pointing in the direction. So what we're doing is we're coming back and we're kind of launching ourselves forward. You see? By the time I get to this line, or the descent, I'll be facing back the other way, or the ball will be facing back the other way. I'm not going to put a keyframe at the bottom. I'm going to let the keyframes sort themselves out, so I'll start pointing that way, because it will look a lot more natural. You can see there that we've got a very slight return. He's just, on this keyframe, he's very slightly pointing in this direction towards the left. So we'll let him sort that out himself, and then as we get second curve, we'll kind of point it. Now what I'm doing is I'm pointing about halfway between the world line and the actual descent line. That's the direction the ball's going to be pointing, about halfway between the two. There we go. And then down. And then instead of going forward, what I'm going to do at this point is I'll just flick him backwards. And I'll make him rotate back even further as we go along here. And then he'll start to come forwards. And then just as we hit these last two frame bangs, we get to there. He'll have gone back a little way. And then the next 1, 2, 3 frames, we'll have him smack forwards. And then it's just going to be a case of doing a couple of frames one way, rotate him in one direction, couple of frames forward, make him rotate in another direction. And we're just going to do this backwards and forwards, and it's going to get longer and longer with the rotation and less movement. A bit less, until eventually he can't be bothered to move anymore. If I take off my auto key and I rewind, and in this view I'll turn off my grid as well, and I'll now play back the whole animation. And you can see what we've got is this lovely ball bouncing and then wobbling at the end. Watch that through once or twice more. And there we go. So that's me using the keyframes and using the keyframe tools in here, just basically. So we've now got a basic idea of what we need to do to create an animation and what's involved in creating an animation. I think I just sneezed then. You might have to cut that bit out. Take this, turn it to 0.8. Might have to cut that bit out as well. So I'll take the multiplier. Actually, start again. I'll take the multiplier and I'll make it 0.8. And then I'll put a target spot in the scene. Here we go as well. And that's going to provide my shadows for me. So I'll just lift that up. That's going to be my key light. And I'll turn on ray trace shadows. And we'll make sure that the density isn't quite so harsh. And I'll make sure that the color is a very slight yellowy color. Maybe not quite as much as that. That looks good. And it's maybe a bit more on the top. There we go. And I'll get myself in a viewport. Now this is where having something like the trajectory switched on gives you a really good idea and helps you frame your whole piece. So I've got my perspective view in an angle that I like there. So I'm going to come to create cameras, create camera from view. So that's created a camera from my perspective viewport now. So you can see we've got perspective, we've got the camera in there, and I'll make sure that's a 35mm camera. So I might need to, just using my dolly camera, move that in a bit. We can see here as I scrub through this animation, that all looks great. And I'll just take the target for this camera and move it across a little bit. There we go, that works for me. And now I'm ready to render that. So as I mentioned before, the render output should look something like this. If I open up my RAM player, should look something along these lines. This is obviously one that I've prepared earlier because we don't need to wait around for the rendering. So you can see there, nice squash, nice stretch, good timing, good movement, and a little bit of a wobble at the end. Excellent. So all you need to do now is to get into your rendering tools and set this up as an animation, which will probably be to say render setup, active time segment, pick a size, and also pick a location to save your files. So files, you can see here I've already got this set up. So if I say I want that to be JPEGs, and I'll say new ball, for example, click save. Image controls, you want it always to be best for a JPEG, click OK. And I can now press render, and that would then go away and render and give me the result that you just saw earlier on. So there we go. It's a nice workshop there, learning how to use all the animation tools and also how to set up your scene afterwards.